Picture inheriting a nation on the verge of collapse, economic turmoil, political fractures, and a Cold War threatening to ignite at any moment. Yet you choose not just to manage the crisis, but to fundamentally reshape the entire system from within. Mikhail Gorbachev didn't merely govern the Soviet Union. He attempted to redesign the trajectory of global power itself. This video reveals the decisions that dismantled decades-old barriers and the powerful adversaries those choices created. What drives a leader to risk everything, knowing that transformation could cost them their position, their legacy, perhaps even their safety? We'll examine how Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost initiatives didn't just alter the USSR, they redefined the possibilities of an entire era. His strategic gambles offer profound lessons about the true cost of attempting systemic change. By the end, you'll understand how calculated decisions or critical miscalculations can alter the fate of millions. It might even prompt you to reconsider moments in your own leadership or life when changing course felt impossible. After all, how far would you go to challenge an entrenched system for something you believed was greater than yourself? Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev nació el 2 de marzo de 1931 en la pequeña aldea agrícola de Privolnoye, en la región de Stavropol, al sur de Rusia. El pueblo, como muchos en el interior soviético, vivía bajo el impacto reciente de la colectivización forzada, una política que había transformado tierras privadas en granjas colectivas controladas por el Estado. Las memorias de hambre de la década anterior aún marcaban a la comunidad. Su nacimiento coincidió con un período de industrialización acelerada en la Unión Soviética, pero el campo seguía atado a métodos rústicos y recursos escasos. La familia Gorbachev pertenecía a la clase campesina y dividía su vida cotidiana entre el cultivo de cereales y la cría de ganado. Tanto el padre, Sergei, como la madre, María, eran conocidos por su resistencia al trabajo y por su compromiso con las normas colectivas impuestas por el régimen. Con la Segunda Guerra Mundial, la región sufrió una ocupación alemana temporal y el joven Mikhail presenció de cerca la destrucción de los cultivos y la escasez de alimentos. Desde niño, Gorbachev ayudaba en las labores del campo y en la adolescencia operaba cosechadoras junto a su padre. Su buen desempeño en el trabajo agrícola le valió una medalla y acceso privilegiado a programas educativos, algo poco común en las zonas rurales de la época. En el ámbito educativo, asistió a la escuela local con un rendimiento por encima del promedio, destacándose en materias como literatura e historia. La educación en la Unión Soviética de ese entonces estaba profundamente impregnada de la ideología marxista-leninista, y el plan de estudios reforzaba valores de colectividad, patriotismo y obediencia al Estado. Los profesores fomentaban la participación en organizaciones juveniles como los Pioneros de Lenin, lo que acercó a Gorbachev a actividades comunitarias y políticas. En 1950, Gorbachev made the significant decision to leave the rural region of Stavropol behind to begin his studies at Moscow State University, one of the most prestigious and competitive institutions in the entire Soviet Union. The move to the capital represented a profound cultural shift that would reshape his worldview entirely. He transitioned from the agricultural routines and simple lifestyle of the countryside to life in a sprawling metropolis characterized by wide avenues, monumental buildings constructed in the Stalinist architectural style, and an urban pace that vividly reflected the center of Soviet political power. Access to the university was extremely competitive and highly selective. Admission depended not only on exceptional academic performance, but also on a demonstrated history of political loyalty to the Communist Party and its ideals. This dual requirement reinforced the importance of his previous trajectory and his family's standing within the community. He chose to pursue a degree in law, a field that offered far more than just legal training and technical knowledge. The program provided solid ideological preparation, carefully aligned with the principles and doctrine of the Communist Party. The curriculum placed heavy emphasis on Soviet constitutional law, the detailed history of the party and its leadership, Marxist-Leninist philosophy, and the foundational principles of scientific socialism as developed by Soviet theorists. Although there was some room for the technical study of laws and legal procedures, the main function of the program was to train administrative cadres who would be capable of sustaining and perpetuating the state structure. Students were being groomed not merely as lawyers but as ideological guardians of the system. During his second year of studies in 1952, he took the significant step of officially joining the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, a decision that would define the rest of his life. Membership involved a rigorous and often invasive approval process that could take months to complete. This included a thorough investigation into his personal and family life, with special attention paid to political background, associations, and any potential ideological deviations. Every aspect of his past was scrutinized by party officials. By successfully joining the party, Gorbachev strengthened his ties with peers and fellow students who would later occupy relevant and influential positions in the state bureaucracy and government apparatus. He methodically built a network of contacts and allies that would prove invaluable in the future as he navigated the complex hierarchies of Soviet political life. In 1953, his personal life took a decisive and transformative turn when he met Raisa Titarenko, a talented and ambitious philosophy student at the same university. Raisa, the daughter of a humble family from the remote region of Siberia, was widely known among students and faculty for her sharp intelligence, natural elegance, and active participation in cultural and political debates that animated university life. She possessed a charisma and intellectual depth that immediately attracted Gorbachev's attention. The relationship quickly evolved beyond mere romantic interest into an intense intellectual partnership built on common interests, shared values, and passionate discussions about the future of socialism and Soviet society. They spent countless hours debating theory, politics, and philosophy. They married that same year in a modest ceremony attended by close friends and family. Their union transformed into a public bond that would last for decades, as Raisa would accompany him throughout virtually his entire political trajectory, serving not only as his wife, but as his closest advisor and confidant. Upon returning to Stavropol in 1955, Gorbachev began his work with the Komsomol, the youth organization of the Communist Party that served as a vital recruitment and training ground for future Soviet leaders. The Komsomol functioned as both a political and administrative school, carefully grooming and preparing future leaders to occupy higher positions within the vast Soviet structure. It was here that he began to gain practical experience in the management of community projects, in the organization of propaganda events designed to promote party ideology, and in the monitoring and implementation of goals established by the party specifically for youth engagement. The work required dedication, organizational skill, and unwavering loyalty to party principles. Toward the end of the 1950s, he was transferred to administrative positions directly linked to the regional agricultural sector, a move that would prove formative for his understanding of Soviet economic challenges. Agriculture was absolutely vital for Stavropol, a region known for its fertile lands and strategic importance in food production. The central authorities invested substantially in the modernization of equipment and cultivation methods in an effort to increase productivity. Gorbachev was made responsible for overseeing complex programs involving irrigation systems, mechanization of farming processes, and the reorganization of collective farms to improve efficiency. By working directly with directors of kolkhozes and sovkhozes, the collective and state farms that formed the backbone of Soviet agriculture, he developed valuable skills in negotiation, conflict resolution, and the coordination of limited resources across vast territories. The decade of the 1960s marked his steady ascent as a respected cadre within the regional committee of the party, earning him recognition far beyond Stavropol. His work in agriculture obtained special recognition following the successful implementation of large-scale irrigation projects that were essential for combating the chronic drought conditions that plagued the southern regions of Russia. These projects not only improved crop yields, but also demonstrated his ability to manage complex technical initiatives and coordinate between various governmental bodies. Simultaneously, Gorbachev cultivated relationships with influential members of the Communist Party in Moscow, strategically creating a network of contacts that transcended the geographical limits of Stavropol. He understood that advancement in the Soviet system required not just competence, but also patronage and visibility among the party elite. In 1970, at just 39 years of age, he was appointed first secretary of the Regional Committee of the Communist Party in Stavropol, the highest position in the local hierarchy and a significant achievement for someone so relatively young. This position carried tremendous responsibility for the economic and political direction of the entire region. The post also provided him with valuable opportunities to interact with high-ranking visitors from Moscow who came to inspect the region or vacation at the nearby resorts. Among these visitors was Yuri Andropov, then head of the KGB, the powerful Soviet intelligence and security agency, who maintained family ties in the area and frequently visited. The contact with Andropov gradually transformed into a relationship of mutual trust and political sponsorship. Andropov recognized Gorbachev's potential and began to mentor him, providing guidance and support. This relationship would become one of the key elements enabling Gorbachev's future transfer to Moscow and his eventual rise to the highest levels of Soviet power. In 1978, Gorbachev was summoned to Moscow to assume the position of Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, taking responsibility for the agricultural sector of the entire nation. This promotion represented the definitive transition from regional politics to the very core of Soviet power, marking a turning point in his career. The Central Committee was the decision-making center for all national policies, wielding immense influence over every aspect of Soviet life. Control over agriculture carried particular strategic weight, as the sector continued to suffer from chronic production deficits that threatened food security and undermined the legitimacy of the socialist economic model. Gorbachev now oversaw ambitious modernization plans, coordinated agricultural policy between the various Soviet republics, and managed the implementation of goals established by the 5-year plan, a monumental task requiring both technical expertise and political acumen. During his first years in Moscow, he gained significant visibility as an active and energetic leader, demonstrating a willingness to personally visit problematic agricultural regions and demand solutions directly in the field rather than relying solely on reports. He traveled extensively throughout the vast Soviet territory, meeting with local officials, farm directors, and workers to understand the challenges firsthand. This hands-on attitude contrasted sharply with that of many high-ranking colleagues who preferred to administer from the comfort of their offices in Moscow, relying on bureaucratic channels and written communications. His approach earned him respect among some circles, while raising suspicions among others who viewed such activism as potentially disruptive. At the same time, Gorbachev systematically expanded his political connections, strengthening ties with influential figures such as Andropov, who continued to support him and advocate for his advancement, and Mikhail Suslov, the party's chief ideologist and a formidable gatekeeper of orthodox communist doctrine. The decisive step in his ascent came in 1980, when he was elected as a full member of the Politburo, the supreme decision-making body of the Soviet Union and the pinnacle of political power. At 49 years of age, he became the youngest member of this exclusive group, which was composed predominantly of elderly leaders who had spent decades navigating the complex bureaucratic apparatus and had grown comfortable with established routines. His presence brought a certain fresh air and new energy to the deliberations, but it also placed him under the watchful and often suspicious eyes of colleagues who were cautious about innovative ideas and protective of their own positions. The Politburo faced serious and mounting challenges at this moment in Soviet history. The economy showed clear signs of stagnation, with declining growth rates. High military expenditures drained resources that could have been invested in civilian sectors, and political wear on the international stage resulted from the costly war in Afghanistan and deteriorating relations with the West. Between 1982 and 1984, Soviet politics underwent a dramatic succession of losses at the highest levels of leadership, creating unprecedented instability. Leonid Brezhnev, who had led the country for 18 years, died in November 1982. He was succeeded by Yuri Andropov, Gorbachev's mentor and patron, who immediately began pushing for modest reforms and anti-corruption measures. However, Andropov's tenure was cut short when he died in February 1984 after barely 15 months in power, his health having deteriorated rapidly. The elderly Konstantin Chernenko, a conservative figure closely associated with the Brezhnev era, then replaced Andropov. Chernenko himself died in March 1985 after just 13 months as General Secretary, having been visibly frail throughout his brief leadership. Gorbachev, as an active and increasingly influential member of the Politburo, participated directly in the intense discussions and behind-the-scenes maneuvering about the country's direction and priorities during this critical and uncertain period. The rapid succession of aging leaders dying in office made it clear to many that the Soviet Union needed younger, more vigorous leadership capable of addressing the mounting crises. In March 1985, following the death of Konstantin Chernenko, Gorbachev was elected General Secretary of the Communist Party, thereby becoming the supreme leader of the Soviet Union and one of the most powerful figures in the world. His ascent was the result of a carefully negotiated consensus within the Politburo, whose members recognized the urgent need for a younger and more energetic figure capable of confronting the stagnant economic and social situation that had gripped the country for years. At 54 years of age, Gorbachev inherited a system deeply marked by decades of rigid central planning, persistently low productivity across most sectors, inefficient allocation of resources, and a growing undercurrent of popular discontent that threatened social stability. The challenges before him were daunting and multifaceted. At the beginning of his leadership, he presented a series of slogans and concepts that would become defining emblems of his government and would eventually reshape the entire Soviet system. These included Uskoreny, meaning acceleration, Perestroika, meaning restructuring, and Glasnost, meaning openness or transparency. The concept of acceleration aimed to revitalize the moribund Soviet economy through greater industrial efficiency, streamlined management practices, and increased investment in technological innovation to close the gap with Western economies. The restructuring proposed gradual but significant adjustments in the system of economic management, introducing elements of decentralization and market mechanisms while theoretically maintaining socialist principles. Meanwhile, the policy of openness sought to dramatically increase governmental transparency, expand freedom of information, encourage public criticism of bureaucratic failures, and allow previously forbidden discussions of sensitive historical and contemporary issues. One of his first concrete initiatives was the controversial anti-alcohol campaign launched in 1985 within months of taking power. Excessive alcohol consumption was widely considered a grave social problem deeply embedded in Soviet culture, directly associated with massive economic losses, decreased labor productivity, public health crises, and family disruption. The campaign included severe restrictions on the sale of alcoholic beverages, substantial increases in prices to discourage consumption, reduced production quotas for distilleries, and even the shocking destruction of established vineyards in wine-producing regions. These measures, though well-intentioned from a public health perspective, generated significant resistance and widespread dissatisfaction among the population. Many citizens viewed the campaign as an intrusion into personal life and a source of inconvenience. The destruction of vineyards also resulted in lost revenue for the state budget at a time when the economy desperately needed funds. In the political sphere, he began to actively promote greater circulation of information within the party apparatus itself and encouraged more frank and honest debates about the nation's pressing problems, breaking with the tradition of secrecy and conformity. Party meetings became forums for discussing previously taboo subjects such as economic inefficiency, corruption, and policy failures. At the same time, Gorbachev carefully sought to balance his reformist proposals with clear signals of loyalty to fundamental socialist principles, attempting to avoid a direct rupture with official ideology that might alarm conservative elements within the party and the military. He positioned his reforms as a return to Leninist ideals rather than an abandonment of communism, claiming he sought to perfect the system rather than replace it. This delicate balancing act would become increasingly difficult to maintain as events unfolded. In April 1986, The catastrophic explosion of reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine became a watershed moment in Soviet history, fundamentally altering the trajectory of Gorbachev's reforms. The disaster revealed profound systemic failures in safety protocols, exposed the slowness and inadequacy of the official response, and demonstrated the deadly consequences of state secrecy and bureaucratic rigidity. Initially, Soviet authorities attempted to minimize the incident, downplaying its severity and withholding critical information from both the public and international observers. However, the massive scale of radioactive contamination soon became impossible to conceal, as radiation detectors in Sweden and other European countries registered alarming levels. The crisis exposed before the entire world the urgent need for greater transparency in Soviet governance. It reinforced the necessity of the glasnost policy that Gorbachev had been advocating, transforming it from an abstract political concept into a matter of life and death. The inadequate response to Chernobyl became a powerful argument for sweeping reforms. Parallel to the reaction to this tragedy, Gorbachev pushed forward with economic and legal reforms specifically oriented toward decentralizing productive management and reducing the suffocating control of the central planning apparatus. The Law on State Enterprise, approved in 1987, granted significantly more autonomy to individual enterprises across the Soviet Union. It allowed them to make their own decisions about production levels, investment priorities, and resource allocation with substantially less direct interference from the central ministries that had traditionally micromanaged every aspect of economic activity. Although the law still maintained certain constraints and did not represent a complete break from central planning, it nonetheless represented a significant and controversial change in the fundamental functioning of the Soviet economy. Factory managers suddenly found themselves with both new freedoms and new responsibilities. In 1988, the law on cooperatives came into force, legalizing small private enterprises in various sectors, including services, light manufacturing, and retail commerce. This legislation marked a historic turning point. For the first time since the 1920s, when Lenin's new economic policy had briefly tolerated limited market activities, private commercial activities were officially tolerated within the nominally socialist system. This legal change stimulated the emergence of individual entrepreneurial initiatives and created opportunities for ambitious individuals to build small businesses. However, it also provoked sharp criticism from conservative sectors within the party and society, who viewed the measure as a dangerous threat to the ideological purity of the regime and a betrayal of socialist principles. Despite the significant limitations imposed on cooperatives and the high tax burden placed upon them to appease critics, the new law was nevertheless a historic step in the gradual opening of the economy and represented a fundamental shift in Soviet economic philosophy. In the political sphere, Gorbachev advanced with the release of prominent political dissidents and implemented substantial reductions in restrictions on freedom of expression and intellectual inquiry. Notable figures such as the renowned physicist Andrei Sakharov, who had spent years in internal exile in the closed city of Gorky as punishment for his human rights advocacy, were permitted to return to public life and resume their work. The press, emboldened by the glasnost policy, began to publish previously unthinkable denunciations about widespread corruption, bureaucratic inefficiency, and historical episodes that had been strictly censored for decades. Journalists investigated and reported on sensitive topics such as the Katyn massacre, where thousands of Polish officers had been executed by Soviet secret police, and the extensive abuses and atrocities of the Stalinist period, including the purges, show trials, and the Gulag system. This unprecedented openness unleashed powerful forces that would ultimately prove difficult to control. Beginning in 1986, Gorbachev started to apply in the diplomatic sphere what he called the new thinking in international relations, a comprehensive reorientation of Soviet foreign policy. The proposal was fundamentally based on the reduction of tensions with the Western Bloc, on the recognition of global interdependence in an increasingly interconnected world, and on the active pursuit of joint solutions to shared problems such as the dangerous nuclear arms race and growing environmental degradation. For Gorbachev, Genuine security could not be guaranteed solely through the accumulation of massive military arsenals and the maintenance of a threatening posture. Instead, it had to be achieved through the cultivation of mutual trust, sustained dialogue, and meaningful cooperation between the great powers. This represented a radical departure from decades of Cold War confrontation and zero-sum thinking. Between 1985 and 1988, a series of crucial meetings took place with American leaders, particularly with President Ronald Reagan, whose relationship with Gorbachev evolved from initial suspicion to cautious collaboration. The summits held in Geneva in 1985, Reykjavik in 1986, Washington in 1987, and Moscow in 1988 served to construct a direct channel of communication between Moscow and Washington that had been largely absent during the most hostile years of the Cold War. These face-to-face meetings allowed the leaders to establish personal rapport and navigate complex negotiations. From these intense negotiations emerged the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, commonly known as the INF Treaty, which was formally signed in December 1987 amid great ceremony. This groundbreaking agreement eliminated an entire class of nuclear missiles with intermediate range capabilities deployed in Europe. It was the first time in history that the two superpotencies had agreed to actually reduce part of their nuclear arsenals rather than merely limiting future growth. The treaty marked a fundamental paradigm shift in bilateral relations and raised hopes for further disarmament. In the military sphere, Gorbachev made the difficult but strategic decision to order the gradual withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan, a costly and unpopular war that had dragged on for nearly a decade. The withdrawal process was initiated in 1988 and concluded in early 1989 with the departure of the last Soviet soldiers. The decision responded to mounting economic pressure as the war drained resources desperately needed at home, as well as to significant political pressure domestically from families who had lost sons in the conflict. It also aimed to restore the international image of the Soviet Union, which had been severely damaged by nearly a decade of brutal conflict that had drawn comparisons to the American experience in Vietnam. The exit marked the abandonment of an interventionist posture in regional conflicts that had characterized Moscow's foreign policy since the 1960s, signaling a new restraint. The absence of Soviet military intervention proved decisive for the dramatic events of 1989, when an unprecedented wave of mass protests and rapid political reforms shook the foundations of communist rule across Eastern Europe. Countries including Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany experienced profound transformations as populations demanded change. In previous decades, Soviet tanks had crushed similar uprisings in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. This time, however, Gorbachev made clear that Moscow would not intervene to prop up failing communist regimes. The fall of the Berlin Wall in November of that year, as jubilant crowds dismantled the concrete barrier that had divided the city for 28 years, symbolized the rapid collapse of the entire socialist bloc in Eastern Europe. Although in the West, this was celebrated as a historic triumph of freedom and democracy over totalitarianism, the episode generated intense criticism within the Soviet Union itself. Many hardliners, military officers, and party conservatives bitterly regarded Soviet passivity as an unforgivable abandonment of strategic allies and a betrayal of decades of sacrifice to build a socialist sphere of influence. In 1989, Gorbachev pushed forward with a major political reform that resulted in the creation of the Congress of People's Deputies, a new legislative body that would be partially elected through popular vote rather than appointed by the party apparatus. This represented a dramatic break from Soviet tradition. Independent candidates and vocal critics of the government, including prominent figures such as Andrei Sakharov and the increasingly popular Boris Yeltsin, successfully won seats in competitive elections, reflecting the emergence of a more plural and contested political space. The sessions of the Congress, which were broadcast live on television for the first time in Soviet history, exposed the general public to debates and confrontations that had previously been kept strictly behind closed doors in party meetings. Millions of citizens watched with fascination as their leaders argued openly about fundamental issues. The impact of these reforms was immediate and profound. The population began to witness open discussions about endemic corruption, bureaucratic abuses, economic failures, and historical crimes that had been hidden for generations. The transparency that Gorbachev had defended as a central pillar of glasnost was now revealing deep contradictions within the system itself, inadvertently weakening the authority of central institutions. Citizens heard officials admit to problems they had long suspected but never seen acknowledged. Despite the destabilizing effects becoming apparent, Gorbachev maintained his intention to reform gradually and in a controlled manner, without completely dismantling the Soviet structure. He believed the system could be improved and democratized while preserving its essential socialist character. In March 1990, a historic decision was made that would fundamentally alter the nature of the Soviet state. The Congress approved the repeal of Article 6 of the Soviet Constitution, which had guaranteed the political monopoly of the Communist Party since the founding of the USSR. This measure formally legalized multi-party politics for the first time in Soviet history. It represented a direct blow to the power base of the party and eliminated the constitutional foundation that had sustained single-party rule for 7 decades. Shortly thereafter, Gorbachev himself was elected president of the Soviet Union, a completely new executive position that had been created specifically to reinforce and centralize authority amid the advancing reforms and mounting political pressures from all directions. He thus became the first and, as history would prove, the only president of the USSR. The new presidential function granted him expanded powers, including the controversial ability to govern by decree under certain circumstances, bypassing the legislature when deemed necessary. However, Gorbachev's political legitimacy was already being seriously questioned by various sectors of society who viewed his indirect election by the Congress rather than by direct popular vote as a calculated maneuver to maintain personal control without genuinely subjecting himself to the will of the people. Critics on both the reformist and conservative sides challenged his mandate. At the same time, regional leaders in the various Soviet republics were beginning to test the limits of their autonomy, emboldened by the political loosening and by the visible decline of central authority. Nationalist movements gained strength in the Baltic states, the Caucasus and elsewhere, demanding greater sovereignty or outright independence. The final period of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s was marked by a rapidly growing wave of nationalism sweeping through the Soviet republics, threatening the very existence of the Union. Independence movements gained tremendous strength in the Baltic countries of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, where local parliaments boldly approved declarations of sovereignty that challenged Moscow's authority. These 3 republics, which had been forcibly incorporated into the Soviet Union in 1940 under the terms of the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, now demanded the restoration of their independence. In the Caucasus region and throughout Central Asia, ethnic and religious tensions also intensified dramatically, often accompanied by massive protests involving hundreds of thousands of people and violent clashes with security forces. The Soviet Union, a vast empire composed of more than 100 distinct ethnic groups speaking dozens of languages, was beginning to feel the overwhelming pressure of regional identities that no longer saw themselves represented or protected by the distant central power in Moscow. In April 1989 in Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, pro-independence demonstrations were violently suppressed by Soviet troops and special forces using sharpened shovels and toxic gas. The brutal crackdown resulted in dozens of deaths, predominantly women, and sparked outrage throughout the Republic and beyond. Similar tragic episodes occurred in Baku, Azerbaijan, in January 1990, when Soviet forces entered the city and killed over 100 people during clashes related to the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. In Vilnius, Lithuania, in January 1991, Soviet military units stormed the television tower, killing 14 civilians who were defending the building. Gorbachev found himself increasingly divided between 2 impossible choices. He could maintain unity through force, risking massive bloodshed and international condemnation, or he could pursue negotiated solutions that might preserve some form of voluntary union. However, The latter option carried the risk of appearing weak and indecisive in the eyes of hardline conservatives, military commanders, and the security establishment who viewed the preservation of the Union as non-negotiable. While the political crisis deepened with each passing month, the economy entered a period of profound and alarming instability that affected every citizen. The economic reforms of perestroika had failed to produce the immediate positive results that had been promised and anticipated. In many cases, the partial reforms actually disrupted established production chains without replacing them with functional market mechanisms, creating the worst of both systems. The shortage of essential goods became an inescapable part of daily life for Soviet citizens. Long lines formed outside stores in cities across the country as people waited for hours to purchase basic necessities like bread, milk, meat, and soap. Rationing systems were introduced in many regions. Meanwhile, suppressed inflation began to erode the purchasing power of the population as prices were gradually liberalized. Labor strikes, which had been extremely rare in Soviet history due to ideological prohibitions, began to spread throughout strategic sectors of the economy, including the vital coal mines of Siberia and the Donbas region, as well as transportation networks that were essential for moving goods. In an attempt to contain the accelerating fragmentation of the Union, Gorbachev proposed a new Union treaty that would fundamentally transform the USSR from a centralized state into a much more flexible federation. The treaty would grant substantially greater autonomy to the republics in managing their own affairs, while theoretically maintaining some form of central coordination. However, the complex negotiations advanced slowly and were deliberately sabotaged from multiple directions. Regional leaders, particularly in the Baltic states and increasingly in Ukraine, preferred complete independence and saw no advantage in any reformed union structure. At the same time, conservative sectors in Moscow, including powerful figures in the military, the KGB and the party apparatus, viewed the proposal as an existential threat to the survival of the Soviet state. They believed any concessions would lead inevitably to total disintegration. In August 1991, the Soviet Union stood on the verge of signing the new Union Treaty, which would grant substantially greater autonomy to the republics and fundamentally restructure the relationship between the center and the periphery. Fearing the imminent loss of power and the complete disintegration of the Soviet state they had served their entire lives, a group of high-ranking party officials, military commanders, and leaders of the KGB organized a desperate coup attempt to remove Gorbachev from power and halt the reform process. During his vacation at his dacha in Foros, Crimea, the president was suddenly isolated in his official residence by the conspirators. All communications were cut off, severing his connection to Moscow and the outside world. Meanwhile, in the capital, the coup plotters declared a state of emergency, announced the formation of an emergency committee, and claimed that Gorbachev was ill and unable to perform his duties. The coup, however, encountered immediate and fierce resistance in Moscow that the conspirators had not anticipated. Boris Yeltsin, then president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, and Gorbachev's increasingly powerful rival, emerged as the principal symbol of opposition to the coup. In a dramatic moment that would define his career, he climbed atop a tank positioned outside the Russian Parliament building, known as the White House, and delivered defiant speeches calling on citizens and soldiers to resist the illegal seizure of power. The popular mobilization against the conspirators grew rapidly as tens of thousands of Muscovites erected barricades around the parliament to defend it. Crucially, several military units began to refuse orders to suppress the protests and instead sided with the defenders. Key commanders expressed doubt about the legitimacy of the coup. Within just 3 days, as the conspiracy unraveled due to poor planning and loss of nerve, the attempted seizure of power collapsed completely. Gorbachev was released from house arrest and returned to the capital, formally resuming his presidential functions amid the chaos. Despite the defeat of the coup plotters and what initially seemed like a victory for reform, the episode actually represented a fatal blow to Gorbachev's authority and credibility. His inability to foresee or prevent the conspiracy, despite the involvement of many officials he had appointed and trusted, exposed critical weaknesses in his control of the state apparatus and his political judgment. Moreover, his image as the paramount leader was now fundamentally compromised. Leadership had effectively shifted to Yeltsin, whose firm stance during the critical days of the crisis had earned him massive popular support, political legitimacy, and the loyalty of key military units. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union, accused of having participated in or at minimum failed to prevent the coup, was suspended from all activities by Yeltsin. This suspension deprived Gorbachev of his principal base of institutional support and the organizational structure through which he had governed. He was left as a president without a party. The failure of the coup dramatically accelerated the independence movement that had been building in the republics for years. The Baltic countries of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which had declared independence before the coup, immediately received international recognition from Western governments and were quickly admitted to the United Nations. Other republics throughout the Soviet Union began declaring sovereignty and independence in rapid succession. Ukraine, the second most populous republic, held a referendum in December 1991 in which an overwhelming majority voted for independence. Russia itself, under the increasingly assertive leadership of Yeltsin, adopted measures that systematically weakened the central government. These included taking control over natural resources located on Russian territory, claiming authority over security forces operating within its borders, and establishing independent economic policies. The Soviet government in Moscow found itself increasingly irrelevant as real power shifted to the Republican capitals. In December 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus gathered in the Belovezhskaya forest in Belarus to sign the historic Belovezh Accords, which formalized the dissolution of the Soviet Union and established the Commonwealth of Independent States in its place. The momentous decision was made without the presence or consultation of Gorbachev, who still formally occupied the presidency of the USSR, but whose actual power had effectively vanished in the wake of the failed coup and the subsequent assertion of Republican sovereignty. He had been reduced to a figurehead presiding over a state that no longer functioned. On December 25, 1991, in a somber televised address watched by millions around the world, he announced his resignation as president. He acknowledged the end of the state he had governed and attempted to reform, and formally transferred his remaining responsibilities to the new Russian authorities headed by Boris Yeltsin. The red flag with hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin that evening, replaced by the Russian tricolor, marking the definitive end of an era. After losing his position of power, Gorbachev sought to redefine his role and maintain relevance in public life through different channels. In 1992, he founded the Gorbachev Foundation, an institution dedicated to research on political, economic, and social issues with a focus on promoting democratic values and analyzing Russia's transition. He also established Green Cross International, an environmental and humanitarian organization oriented toward addressing ecological challenges and promoting sustainable development. Gorbachev began to travel frequently to participate in international conferences, forums, and speaking engagements around the world. In these settings, he was consistently treated as an elder statesman and a moral reference point by foreign leaders and intellectuals who admired his role in ending the Cold War, even as he remained controversial at home. In 1996, motivated by concern about Russia's direction under Yeltsin and believing he still had something to offer, he made the surprising decision to compete for the presidency of the Russian Federation. He faced Yeltsin and other candidates at the ballot box in what would prove to be a humbling experience. His campaign platform defended a vision of democratic socialism, attempting to combine market economy principles with robust social protections and a stronger safety net for citizens suffering from the harsh transition. However, his electoral performance was disastrous. He obtained less than 1% of the votes cast, a devastating result that provided undeniable evidence of the profound deterioration of his image within Russia itself. For the vast majority of Russian citizens, Gorbachev remained inextricably associated with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The severe economic crisis and hyperinflation of the early 1990s, the loss of superpower status, and the chaos and humiliation of the transition period. Many blamed him personally for their suffering. His personal life also suffered a devastating blow during this difficult period. In 1999, his beloved wife Raisa died from leukemia after months of intensive medical treatment in Germany. Her death was a profound loss for Gorbachev, who had relied on her as his closest confidant and intellectual partner throughout his political career. They had been married for over 4 decades, and she had been a constant presence at his side through every triumph and crisis. After Raisa's death, he visibly withdrew from public life for a time, reducing the frequency of his public appearances significantly. He dedicated himself to writing memoirs, reflecting deeply on his trajectory, contemplating the choices he had made, and pondering the fate of the country he had once led and the legacy he would leave behind. At the beginning of the 2000s, Gorbachev maintained a constant and active presence in international debates, addressing critical issues such as nuclear disarmament, global governance, climate change, and environmental protection. He participated regularly in prestigious forums such as the Munich Security Conference and the Earth Summit, consistently advocating for multilateral solutions to global problems and warning against unilateral action by powerful nations. He also published several books and numerous articles analyzing his experience in power, reflecting on the decisions he had made, and proposing democratic reforms for Russia that he believed could create a more just and open society. Despite his sustained intellectual engagement and moral authority on the international stage, he had virtually no political influence within Russia itself. The government of Vladimir Putin, who had come to power in 2000, followed a distinctly centralizing agenda that emphasized state control, national sovereignty, and the restoration of Russian power. This approach was fundamentally at odds with Gorbachev's proposals for greater openness, democratic pluralism, and integration with the West. Gorbachev maintained regular contact with international leaders across the political spectrum and was frequently received as an honored guest at diplomatic events, state ceremonies, and academic gatherings throughout Europe, the United States, and other regions. He used these platforms to advocate for his vision of international cooperation. For his part, he consistently maintained that reconciliation with the world and constructive engagement with Western nations were vital for the future prosperity and security of Russia. His public image remained deeply divided along geographical lines. Outside of Russia, particularly in Western Europe and the United States, he was widely admired and even celebrated as the principal architect of the peaceful end of the Cold War, a statesman who had courageously dismantled totalitarian structures. Within Russia, however, many compatriots continued to view him as primarily responsible for the humiliating collapse of a superpower and the devastating social and economic crisis of the 1990s that had impoverished millions. During this period, he also participated in various cultural projects and dialogue initiatives that seemed unconventional for a former head of state. In 2006, he made a surprising appearance in advertising campaigns for international brands, including a notable television commercial for Louis Vuitton and another for Pizza Hut. He directed a portion of the substantial fees he received from these commercial ventures to finance the activities of his foundation and support its educational and research programs. Gorbachev continued to actively promote academic conferences and seminars focused on Russia's political and economic transition, bringing together scholars, economists, and political scientists. He invited specialists from different countries to debate alternatives to the prevailing model of governance and to explore pathways toward a more democratic future for Russia. Mikhail Gorbachev died on August 30, 2022, in Moscow at the age of 91. His death closed the chapter on the life of a leader whose decisions and influence fundamentally shaped the final decades of the 20th century and altered the course of world history. The legacy he left behind continues to be a subject of intense controversy and passionate debate that shows no signs of resolution. For some time, particularly in the West and among Russian liberals, he was the courageous reformer who liberated millions from political oppression, ended the totalitarian system, helped bring about the peaceful conclusion of the Cold War, and opened possibilities for freedom that had been unimaginable. For others, especially among Russian nationalists and those who suffered economically during the transition. He was the leader who presided over the disintegration of a great empire, betrayed Soviet allies, surrendered geopolitical positions without adequate compensation, and opened the path toward a chaotic decade of economic collapse, social disintegration, and national humiliation that still shapes Russian politics today. Gorbachev was one of the most prominent and consequential leaders of the 20th century, a figure capable of generating profound admiration and bitter resentment in equal measure across different populations and political perspectives. His sweeping reforms opened the path to freedom of expression for millions who had lived under censorship, brought about the peaceful end of the Cold War that had threatened humanity with nuclear annihilation, and enabled the fundamental reconfiguration of Europe through the reunification of Germany and the liberation of Eastern European nations from Soviet domination. However, these same reforms also coincided with catastrophic economic collapse that impoverished vast segments of the population, the disintegration of the Soviet state itself, and the dramatic loss of global power and international influence that Russia had wielded as a superpower. To this day, scholars, historians, and political analysts continue to debate vigorously whether he was a visionary leader tragically betrayed by unfavorable circumstances beyond his control, or a well-intentioned but ultimately naive politician who failed to understand or manage the far-reaching consequences of his own decisions and unleashed forces he could not contain. What about you? Do you believe that Gorbachev was the man who saved the world from nuclear confrontation and liberated millions from oppression? Or was he primarily responsible for destroying the country he led and causing immense suffering through the chaotic collapse of the Soviet system? Leave your opinion in the comments section below. Your perspective is essential for this ongoing debate, and we genuinely want to hear diverse viewpoints on this complex historical figure. Subscribe to the channel and activate notifications to continue following stories that fundamentally change the course of humanity and shape the world we live in today. After all, if you are not here for the next uploads, you might miss the answers to some of the most fascinating questions about history, politics, and the forces that have driven global events. Do not let that happen.